Lord Peter Wimsey had arrived in the village of Thornwick-Abbas with the laudable intention of correcting a particularly egregious misattribution in the parish register. Someone had credited the restoration of the chancel screen to Guglielmus Artifex, 1487, when any fool with a working knowledge of medieval Latin could see it should read Guglielmus Faber. The distinction between an artist and a craftsman might seem trifling to the vulgar mind, but precision in such matters was, as Wimsey often observed, what separated civilization from chaos. He had not expected to find himself, barely an hour after his arrival, standing in the spotless kitchen of Thornwick Manor, contemplating the mortal remains of Mr. Cedric Thornwick himself, while the local constabulary scratched their collective heads over what appeared to be a perfectly impossible murder. "I do beg your pardon. Inspector Mellors," Wimsey said, adjusting his monocle with the particular delicacy of a man who had just noticed something rather more interesting than medieval masonry. "But has anyone remarked upon the extraordinary cleanliness of these windows? They possess that peculiar transparency which suggests either the hand of a zealot or the eye of a man who wishes to see everything while revealing nothing of himself." Inspector Mellors, a solid Yorkshire man whose patience had been sorely tested by 3 hours of hysterical servants and one extremely deceased squire, regarded Lord Peter with the expression of a man who has discovered philosophy in his porridge. "With respect, my lord, I fail to see how the state of the kitchen windows bears upon Mr. Thornwick being found dead in his locked study with his head stove in and no weapon to be discovered." "Oh, quite possibly it doesn't," Wimsey agreed cheerfully, stepping delicately around a puddle of what appeared to be gravy that had met with some unfortunate accident. "Though I confess myself intrigued by the domestic arrangements of a household where the windows gleam like mirrors, while the kitchen range burns hot enough to roast the ox of Bashan, despite the fact that the cook swears she banked the fires at 9 o'clock last evening. Mrs. Dalrymple, the cook in question, a formidable woman whose starched apron suggested she conducted her kitchen with the precision of a military campaign, dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief. "Indeed I did, my lord. Banked them proper, same as I've done every night for the past 12 years. But when I came down this morning at 5:30 to start the breakfast, the range was burning like the very fires of, well, like it had been stoked all night long. Most illuminating," Wimsey murmured, making a note in his small leather book. "And the windows, Mrs. Dalrymple. I observe they possess that particular brilliance which suggests recent and devoted attention. Cleaned them yesterday afternoon, my lord, same as always. Tuesdays and Fridays for the kitchen and scullery, Mondays and Thursdays for the main house. Mr. Thornwick was most particular about his windows, he was. Said he wouldn't have his view of the countryside spoiled by smudges and fingerprints. Bunter, who had been conducting his own silent investigation of the kitchen's more technical aspects, approached with the measured tread of a man who has discovered something worthy of attention. If I might venture an observation, my lord, the range appears to have been burning at maximum capacity for several hours. The coal scuttle is nearly empty, yet Mrs. Dalrymple assures me it was full yesterday evening." "Curiouser and curiouser," Wimsey said, wandering toward the kitchen window, which offered an excellent view of the manor's east wing. Through the crystalline glass, he could see the study window directly opposite, its heavy curtains still drawn despite the lateness of the morning hour. "Tell me, Mrs. Dalrymple, was Mr. Thornwick in the habit of drawing his study curtains during daylight hours?" "Oh, no, my lord. Quite the opposite. Mr. Thornwick always said natural light was God's gift to scholars, and he wouldn't waste it by hiding behind drapery. Those curtains were never drawn except at night, and then only after he'd finished his evening's work." Inspector Mellors consulted his notebook with the air of a man trying to impose order upon chaos. "According to the butler, that's Higgins, Mr. Thornwick retired to his study after dinner last night at approximately 8:30. Said he had correspondence to attend to and wasn't to be disturbed. Higgins brought him his usual pot of tea at 9 o'clock, and that was the last anyone saw of him alive." "And this morning?" Wimsey inquired, though his attention seemed divided between the inspector's recitation and something he had noticed about the way the morning light struck the study window. Higgins went to take him his morning tea at 8 o'clock sharp, as was his custom. Found the study door locked from the inside. No answer to his knocking. He waited a quarter of an hour, thinking perhaps the master had overslept, then used his passkey. Found Mr. Thornwick lying beside his desk with his skull crushed, and the room sealed up tight as a tomb. Sealed, you say? Wimsey's eyebrows performed a small arabesque of interest. Windows latched from the inside, I presume. Aye, and the chimneys barely wide enough for a cat, let alone a man. Dr. Pemberton estimates he'd been dead since sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, which makes it all the more peculiar. Wimsey made another note, this one accompanied by a small sketch of what appeared to be a window frame. And the temperature of the room when Higgins discovered the body? Uncommonly warm, according to Higgins. Said it was like walking into a greenhouse, despite the fire having burned down to ashes. A hot room, Wimsey mused, heated by a cold grate. Discovered through clean windows by a man carrying— What was Higgins carrying, Inspector? Mellors frowned. The morning tea service, my lord. Silver tray, china pot, cup and saucer, milk jug, sugar bowl. Same as every morning for the past 20 years. Ah, yes, the tea service. Wimsey's pale eyes brightened with sudden interest. I don't suppose anyone has examined the contents of that pot, or perhaps more importantly, the temperature of the milk. Mrs. Dalrymple looked puzzled. Well, the tea was stone cold when Higgins brought the tray back down, my lord. But that's only natural, considering the circumstances. As for the milk— She paused, a frown creasing her broad forehead. Now that's odd. The milk was cold as ice, it was. Colder than it should have been, even sitting in the pantry overnight. I remarked upon it to Mary, the parlour maid. Said it was cold as winter morning, though the pantry's never that chill. Cold milk, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully, in a warm room, heated by a cold fire, in a house where the kitchen burns like Nebuchadnezzar's furnace and the windows shine like the crystal sea. Inspector Mellors, I do believe we are dealing with someone who possesses either a very twisted sense of irony or a very precise understanding of domestic arrangements, possibly both. He moved toward the kitchen door, pausing to examine once more the gleaming windows that reflected the grey morning sky like sheets of polished silver. Tell me, Mrs. Dalrymple, in your 12 years of service, has Mr. Thornwick ever before requested that his study curtains be drawn during daylight hours? Never, my lord. He was most particular about his natural light, as I said. Why, just last week he had me polish the study windows special, said he wanted to be able to see every detail of the moor from his desk. And yet yesterday evening someone drew those curtains, Wimsey observed. Someone who either wished to prevent others from seeing in, or perhaps, more intriguingly, to prevent someone inside from seeing out. As they prepared to examine the study itself, Wimsey cast one final glance at the kitchen's immaculate windows. Their surface so clean they seemed to deny the very existence of glass, offering instead a pure, unimpeded view of the world beyond. It was, he reflected, rather like looking into the mind of a murderer, everything crystal clear, yet somehow inverted, as if viewed through a mirror that reflected not light, but shadow. Come, Inspector, he said, his voice carrying that note of quiet anticipation that Bunter had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelation. Let us examine this study of Mr. Thornwick's. I have a curious fancy that we shall find it as precisely arranged as Mrs. Dalrymple's kitchen, and quite as revealing. After all, a man who insists upon clean windows and cold milk in a house where fires burn unattended is clearly a person of very particular habits. And particular habits, as any student of human nature will tell you, are invariably the undoing of those who seek to exploit them. The morning sun continued to stream through Mrs. Dalrymple's spotless windows, illuminating what was rapidly becoming one of the more intellectually stimulating domestic mysteries Lord Peter Wimsey had encountered in some considerable time. The study of Thornwick Manor possessed that peculiar quality of rooms where violent death has recently occurred, a sort of hushed expectancy, as if the very wallpaper were holding its breath. The heavy oak panelling seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the turkey carpet, though immaculately maintained, now bore the unfortunate distinction of having cushioned a man's final fall. Cedric Thornwick lay precisely where death had claimed him, beside his mahogany desk, one hand doubled beneath him in an attitude that suggested he had been reaching for something when the blow fell. The wound above his left ear had the clean, decisive quality that spoke of a single, well-aimed strike rather than frenzied violence. There was surprisingly little blood. It had dried to a dark, shellac-like stain that caught the morning light filtering through the heavy curtains. Uncommonly warm in here, Wimsey observed, removing his gloves with the delicacy of a man handling evidence. Inspector, would you be so good as to test that radiator? Inspector Mellors obliged, placing his palm against the cast-iron fixture. Hot as blazes, my lord. Valves turned full open, indeed, and yet Mrs. Dalrymple assures us the fires were properly banked last evening. Wimsey approached the cold grate, where grey ashes lay in perfect, undisturbed formation. Curious how a room can be heated by a fire that clearly hasn't burned for hours. Almost as curious as windows that gleam like mirrors, while curtains remain drawn against the very light they're meant to reveal. He moved to examine the window latch with his monocle, noting the faint film of recent handling on the brass and a barely perceptible smear of something greasy along the catch. Someone has been adjusting these latches, Inspector. Recently, and with considerable care to avoid leaving obvious traces. Bunter, who had been conducting his own silent survey, approached with his customary discretion. If I might observe, my lord, there appear to be traces of salt along the skirting board near the door. Salt? Wimsey knelt to examine the crystalline residue. How domestically intriguing! One might almost suspect our murderer of attempting to preserve the scene, rather than conceal it. Higgins entered the study with the measured tread of a man who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of being indispensable while remaining invisible. His face bore that expression of professional neutrality that butlers cultivate like prize roses, beautiful to behold, but revealing nothing of the soil beneath. Now then, Higgins, Wimsey began, settling into the leather chair behind Thornwick's desk with the casual authority of a man equally at home in drawing rooms and crime scenes. You've served Mr. Thornwick for 2 decades. That suggests either exceptional loyalty or exceptional wages. In your experience, was he a man given to sudden changes in his evening routine? Never, my lord. Mr. Thornwick was precision incarnate. Tea at 9, correspondence until 10:30, lights out by 11. He varied no more than Big Ben, and yet last evening something did vary. The curtains, for instance, drawn against his usual preference for natural light. The study door locked from within when you brought his morning tea. The temperature of this room heated to tropical intensity despite a cold grate. Wimsey's pale eyes fixed on the butler with the intensity of a naturalist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Tell me, Higgins, did Mr. Thornwick receive any visitors yesterday? Any telephone calls of an unusual nature? The butler's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. There was a telephone call, my lord, at 9:20. The caller rang off without speaking when I answered. How intriguing. And did Mr. Thornwick emerge from his study to inquire about this mysterious communication? No, my lord, though I did observe light beneath the study door when I made my final rounds at 10:30. But that was not unusual. Mr. Thornwick often worked late into the evening. Wimsey made a note in his small leather book. And the tea service you brought this morning, was there anything unusual about it? The temperature of the milk, perhaps, or the arrangement of items on the tray? The milk was uncommonly cold, my lord, cold as winter morning, though the pantry maintains a consistent temperature. And Higgins hesitated, as if weighing the wisdom of his next words. Yes, the small oval salver that usually sits on the hall console was missing, my lord. I was obliged to use the larger rectangular one from the pantry. Missing, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. How very inconvenient. And when did you last observe this salver in its proper place? Yesterday evening, my lord, when I made my rounds before retiring. Mary entered with the nervous energy of a sparrow that suspects the presence of cats. Her hands, Wimsey noted, bore the telltale redness of recent and vigorous scrubbing, curious in a household where Mrs. Dalrymple maintained such exacting standards of cleanliness. Mary, Wimsey said gently, I understand you were responsible for drawing the evening curtains throughout the house. Did you draw those in the study? Oh, no, my lord. The denial came with surprising vehemence. I never touched the study curtains. Mr. Thornwick was most particular. No one was to disturb anything in his study without express permission. And yet someone drew them yesterday evening. Someone with either permission or considerable confidence in their right to do so. Mary's eyes darted nervously toward Higgins before she answered. I did notice they were drawn when I passed through the hall at 8:30, my lord. It struck me as odd, but I thought perhaps Mr. Thornwick had done it himself. For what purpose, do you suppose? I couldn't say, my lord. though she paused, biting her lower lip. "Yes?" "Well, my lord, Mr. Thornwick had taken to painting in the evenings lately. Said the different light gave him new inspiration. He'd set up his easel by the study window to catch the last rays of sun. But if the curtains were drawn, quite impossible to paint," Wimsey finished. "How very observant of you, Mary. And this evening painting, when did this new habit begin?" "About a month ago, my lord. Just after his nephew Geoffrey visited, Mrs. Dalrymple, summoned to elaborate on this intriguing family connection, entered with the air of a woman who possessed information but doubted the wisdom of sharing it. "Geoffrey Thornwick," she began reluctantly, "Mr. Thornwick's sister's boy. An artistic young man, though not what you'd call successful at it. Mr. Thornwick had been supporting him, lodgings in London, art supplies, that sort of thing." "And recently?" Wimsey prompted. "Recently, Mr. Thornwick had grown weary of what he called throwing good money after bad. There was a terrible row about it 3 weeks ago. Geoffrey stormed out, swearing he'd never set foot in the house again." "A dramatic exit," Wimsey observed. "And have you seen hide nor hair of young Geoffrey since this theatrical departure?" "Not a glimpse, my lord, though his landlady in London says he's been away for the past week." "Couldn't say where." Wimsey exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Mellors. "How convenient. A nephew with both motive and opportunity, conveniently absent when inquiries are made." Returning his attention to the physical evidence, Wimsey began a more systematic examination of the study. The desk blotter bore the faint impression of recently written correspondence, which Bunter's careful pencil work revealed to contain the fragment: "Have been patient beyond patience. If you will not answer by return, I shall come to you. You will not like me when I come. C.T. Our late host had a definite way with correspondence," Wimsey observed. "The question remains, to whom was this charming missive addressed?" He moved to the mantelpiece, where 2 medieval grotesques served as bookends, their leering faces flanking a gap where some volume had recently stood. A light dusting of the area revealed the outline of a book approximately 6 inches wide, removed and hastily replaced, judging by the disturbed dust pattern. "Inspector," Wimsey said, his voice carrying that note of quiet satisfaction that Bunter had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelation, "I believe we are dealing with someone who understands the precise habits of this household rather too well. Someone who knows exactly when tea is served, when rounds are made, when fires are banked, and when curtains are drawn." He paused at the study door, examining the Yale lock with particular attention to the brass snib mechanism. "Someone who also understands that the most effective way to create an impossible crime is not to make it truly impossible, but merely to make it appear so to those who discover it." The faint whine of pipes heating water somewhere in the house's depths provided an oddly domestic counterpoint to these observations, a reminder that even in the presence of violent death, the ordinary business of living and dying continued with mechanical precision. "Come, Inspector," Wimsey said finally, gathering his coat with the air of a man who had seen enough for the moment. "I believe a conversation with Miss Postlethwaite at the telephone exchange might prove illuminating, and perhaps a word with young Geoffrey's London associates. After all, artistic temperaments and family quarrels have been known to produce the most dramatically final results." As they prepared to leave the study, Wimsey cast one final glance at the drawn curtains, their heavy fabric concealing the very view that Thornwick had been so eager to capture in his evening paintings. It was, he reflected, rather like examining a locked door. Sometimes the most important thing was not what lay behind it, but who had taken such care to ensure it remained. Closed, the village of Thornwick Abbas possessed that peculiar quality of English rural communities where information travelled faster than the Morning Post and with considerably more embellishment. By noon, Lord Peter found himself holding court in the snug of the Red Lion, where the local worthies had assembled with the eager anticipation of hounds who had caught a promising scent. Miss Postlethwaite, summoned from her telephone exchange, arrived with the ceremonial dignity of one whose profession placed her at the very nerve center of village intelligence. She settled herself with the precision of a general preparing for battle, her steel-grey hair arranged with military exactitude, and her pale eyes bright with the satisfaction of possessing crucial information. "Lord Peter Wimsey," she announced, consulting a small leather-bound notebook with the reverence due to Holy Scripture. I have maintained the Thornwick Exchange for 17 years, and I can tell you that last evening's telephone activity was most irregular. Irregular in what particular way, Miss Postlethwaite? Wimsey inquired, accepting a pint of the local bitter with the appreciation of a man who understood that information. Like good ale, required proper lubrication. At 20 minutes past 9 precisely, a trunk call came through from London, Camden Exchange to be specific. The caller requested connection to Thornwick Manor, but when Higgins answered with his customary Thornwick Manor, "Good evening," there was nothing but breathing for perhaps 10 seconds. Then the line went dead. Inspector Mellors leaned forward with interest. "Could you identify the voice?" "A young man's voice, Inspector, though he spoke in a whisper as if he feared being overheard. But there was something familiar about the cadence, the way he paused between words, rather theatrical, if you take my meaning." "Theatrical," Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. "How very illuminating." "And this theatrical quality, it reminded you of someone in particular?" Miss Postlethwaite's cheeks coloured slightly. "Well, my lord, it put me in mind of young Geoffrey Thornwick. He has always had that manner of speaking. Lots of dramatic pauses, as if he's performing for an invisible audience. Though I should add that the call originated from London, not locally. Mr. Josiah Wickham, the Red Lion's proprietor, required no prompting to share his observations. A man whose livelihood depended upon his ability to remember faces and their associated drinking habits. He possessed the sort of detailed memory that made policemen weep with gratitude. Seen young Geoffrey about the village these past few days. "I have," Wickham declared, polishing a glass with unnecessary vigor. "Staying at the Shepherd's Rest, 2 villages over. But he's been haunting our lanes like a lost spirit. Mrs. Pemberton, that's the doctor's wife, spotted him 3 nights running, walking the footpath behind the manor. Always around midnight, always keeping to the shadows. 3 nights of nocturnal reconnaissance," Wimsey observed. "How very methodical of him. Did he favour your establishment with his custom during these mysterious perambulations?" "Twice he came in, my lord. Sat in that corner booth, nursing a single whisky for the better part of 2 hours each time. Kept checking his pocket watch, as if he had an appointment to keep, though he never spoke to a soul. Left both nights at precisely 11:15. Wimsey made a note in his small leather book. 11:15. How remarkably specific. One wonders what engagement required such punctual departure. The landlord's wife, a sharp-eyed woman who clearly managed both the establishment and her husband with equal efficiency, spoke up from behind the bar. "There was something else, my lord. Young Geoffrey had a notebook with him, kept scribbling in it while he watched the clock. When he left it open on the table, I couldn't help but notice it was full of sketches." "What manner of sketches, Mrs. Wickham?" "Drawings of the manor house, my lord. Different angles, all very precise and measured-like. Particular attention to the windows and doors, as if he was planning something that required exact knowledge of the building's layout." Inspector Mellors consulted his notebook with growing satisfaction. "We've had word from the railway station, my lord. Porter there remembers selling a ticket to London to a flustered young gentleman just after midnight last night. Matches Geoffrey's description perfectly. Tall, pale, wearing a green scarf." "A green scarf," Wimsey mused. "How very artistic, though one might question the wisdom of wearing such a distinctive garment while conducting clandestine activities." "There's more, my lord," Mellors continued. "We found this at the telephone box outside the King's Head." He produced a painter's rag, stiff with turpentine and bearing distinct smears of what appeared to be oil paint, left on the shelf inside the box, as if someone had used it to wipe their hands. Bunter, who had been conducting his own quiet investigation, approached with his customary discretion. "If I might add, my lord, inquiries at the local art supplies shop reveal that someone matching Geoffrey's description purchased a considerable quantity of materials 3 days ago. Oils, brushes, and rather unusually, a large quantity of white spirit." "White spirit," Wimsey repeated. "For cleaning, one presumes, though artists are not typically so concerned with tidiness in the midst of creative fervour." A telegram from Detective Sergeant Parker provided additional confirmation of Geoffrey's suspicious activities. "Geoffrey Thornwick departed Chelsea. Lodging suddenly. 1 week ago stop. Landlady reports unpaid rent and studio in disarray. Stop large painting delivered day before departure origin. Unknown stop investigating further. Stop Parker. A large painting, Wimsey observed, reading the telegram aloud. One wonders what manner of artistic inspiration required such immediate attention that it prompted our young aesthete to abandon his London obligations. Mrs. Dalrymple, who had been summoned to provide additional details about the household routine, shifted uncomfortably. Begging your pardon, my lord, but there's something I should mention about Mr. Thornwick's recent painting activities. Yes, Mrs. Dalrymple? Well, my lord, he wasn't painting landscapes as I first thought. He'd taken to doing portraits in the evenings, always the same subject. A young man with dark hair shone from behind, looking out toward the moor. Never could see the face clearly from the kitchen window, but the posture reminded me of Geoffrey. Higgins, who had accompanied the cook, cleared his throat diplomatically. Mr. Thornwick destroyed those portraits 3 nights ago, my lord. Burned them in the study fireplace. Said they weren't achieving the effect he desired. Destroyed, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. How very final. And the missing salver that you mentioned earlier. When did you last observe it in its proper position? Yesterday evening during my final rounds, my lord. It was in place at 10:30 when I secured the house for the night. But this morning, when I went to prepare the tea service, it had vanished entirely. Inspector Mellors spread the accumulated evidence before them, like a man laying out a winning hand at cards. There you have it, my lord. Motive: the nephew's been cut off financially. Opportunity: he's been surveilling the house for days. Method: artist's materials suggest he's been planning something requiring precision. And flight: he bolted for London immediately after the crime. A compelling narrative, Inspector, Wimsey agreed, though his tone suggested something less than complete conviction. Indeed, one might say it's almost too compelling, rather like a stage play where all the props are positioned with theatrical precision for the audience's convenience. He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the grey afternoon sky. Consider, if you will, the curious matter of timing. Our Geoffrey makes mysterious telephone calls, conducts midnight surveillance, purchases art supplies, and then commits murder with a precision that would do credit to a military campaign. Yet he leaves behind a trail of evidence that a blind bloodhound could follow. Criminals make mistakes when they're desperate, my lord, Mellors observed. Indeed they do, Inspector. But they rarely make them with such systematic thoroughness. The green scarf visible to half the village, the painter's rag conveniently abandoned, the precise timing of his departure. It all suggests either remarkable stupidity or remarkable calculation. Wimsey adjusted his monocle with the particular delicacy of a man who had noticed something others had missed. And then there's the matter of the study itself, heated to tropical warmth by a cold grate, with curtains drawn against the very light that Thornwick valued above all else. These details suggest a mind that understands not merely how to commit murder, but how to stage it for maximum effect. He turned back to the assembled company, his pale eyes bright with the particular gleam that Bunter had learned to associate with impending revelation. No, Inspector, I suspect we are dealing with someone who has used our artistic nephew as what the theatrical profession would call a decoy, a performer whose obvious guilt serves to distract attention from the true drama being enacted elsewhere. The afternoon light continued to fade beyond the Red Lion's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the growing complexity of what had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of family violence. It was, Wimsey reflected, rather like examining a painting where the obvious subject matter concealed a more subtle composition, visible only to those with the patience to look beyond the surface. Come, Inspector, he said finally, gathering his coat with the air of a man who had learned enough for one day. I believe it's time we paid a visit to the Shepherd's Rest. After all, if young Geoffrey has been conducting such elaborate surveillance, he may have observed something that even he doesn't realize is significant. In my experience, the most revealing testimony often comes from those who believe themselves to be merely witnesses rather than participants. As they prepared to depart, Wimsey cast one final glance at the evidence spread before them, each piece pointing inexorably toward Geoffrey's guilt, yet somehow lacking the organic randomness that characterized genuine criminal panic. It was, he thought, rather like examining a garden where the flowers had been arranged too perfectly, suggesting the hand of a gardener who understood not only cultivation but the art of concealment. The Shepherd's Rest possessed that particular melancholy of establishments caught between respectability and ruin. Its whitewashed walls bore the stains of decades of rural weather, while its small windows gleamed with the desperate cleanliness of a proprietor who understood that appearances, however threadbare, must be maintained. Mrs. Plackett, the landlady, received their arrival with the nervous energy of a woman who had spent the morning fielding inquiries from constables and was beginning to suspect that her modest establishment had achieved an unwelcome notoriety. "Young Mr. Geoffrey," she repeated, wringing her hands in her apron with genuine distress. "Oh, my lord, such a troubled young gentleman he was. Took the upstairs back room, the one with the view toward the manor. He said he needed it for his artistic work. Paid for 3 nights in advance, cash in hand but barely touched his meals, and spent most of his time staring out that window like a man possessed." Wimsey settled himself in the cramped parlor with the careful attention of a naturalist examining a particularly interesting specimen. The room bore that peculiar atmosphere of transient occupancy, too clean to suggest permanent residence, too worn to offer genuine comfort. And his general demeanor during his stay, Mrs. Plackett? Was he agitated? Secretive? Given to midnight wanderings? All of those, my lord, and more besides. He'd pace his room for hours. I could hear the floorboards creaking overhead like a metronome gone mad. Then slip out after dark, always returning before dawn with his boots muddy and his clothes damp with dew. She leaned forward conspiratorially. And the measuring, my lord. Constant measuring with a bit of string, marking things down in his notebook like he was surveying for the county. Geoffrey's former accommodation proved to be a cramped chamber under the eaves, possessed of that particular melancholy which clings to rooms recently vacated by their occupants. Yet, despite Mrs. Plackett's assurance that the young man had departed with all his belongings, Wimsey's trained eye detected the subtle traces that even careful cleaning cannot entirely eliminate. The small writing table bore the faint impressions of recent use, and in the drawer, overlooked in what had clearly been a hasty departure, lay a length of string knotted at precise intervals. Bunter lifted it with his gloved fingers, examining the knots with the attention of a scholar parsing ancient text. "Measuring cord, my lord," he observed. "Intervals at 9, 12, and 16 inches, standard measurements for window casements and door frames." "How very methodical," Wimsey murmured, examining the string through his monocle. "Our young artist appears to have approached his surveillance with the precision of an architect." "What else, Bunter?" A more thorough search revealed additional evidence of Geoffrey's systematic approach. A small square of felt, the sort used beneath silver to prevent scratching, bearing traces of salt and a faint chemical odor that Bunter identified as white spirit. The washstand, though recently scrubbed, retained the lingering aroma of turpentine, while the fireplace contained the grey residue of recently burned papers. "Someone has been most thorough in their housekeeping," Wimsey observed, kneeling to examine the ash with a small silver implement from his waistcoat. Though perhaps not quite thorough enough. He extracted a partially burned fragment, holding it to the light. "What have we here?" "Now at precisely 10:47, and below that, curtains drawn, light extinguished, 11:15. Inspector Mellors leaned forward eagerly. "Surveillance notes. This proves Geoffrey was watching the house, recording the household's movements with military precision." "Indeed it does, Inspector. Though one might question why a man planning murder would be so meticulous in documenting his preparations, only to abandon such incriminating evidence in a manner that virtually guarantees its discovery." Mrs. Plackett, emboldened by their obvious interest in her establishment, volunteered additional information with the enthusiasm of a witness who had suddenly realized her importance to the proceedings. "There was a telephone call, my lord, yesterday evening, just after 9 o'clock. Whoever it was spoke in whispers, most peculiar-like, and when I told them young Geoffrey wasn't in, they asked me to give him a message." "What manner of message?" "Tell him the windows are clean and the oven is hot." Strange words, my lord, but the caller was most insistent that I repeat them exactly. And there was something in the background, a sound like water running or perhaps steam hissing, like when the copper's boiling for the washing. Wimsey's pale eyes sharpened with interest. "Steam, you say? And the time, you're certain it was just after 9 o'clock? 9:15 by the parlor clock, my lord. I remember because I'd just finished clearing the supper things." "Most illuminating," Wimsey said, making a note in his small leather book. "Inspector, if memory serves, Higgins reported receiving a mysterious call at 20 minutes past 9. A caller who breathed for 10 seconds, then rang off. Yet Mrs. Plackett received her cryptic message at 9:15. 2 calls 5 minutes apart," Mellors observed. "Precisely. Which suggests either remarkable coincidence or remarkable coordination. Someone was taking considerable care to ensure that both Geoffrey and the household at Thornwick Manor received their respective communications at precisely the right moment, when Mrs. Plackett led them to examine the room more thoroughly. The extent of the clean-up became apparent. Not only had Geoffrey departed with unusual completeness, but someone had taken extraordinary care to eliminate any trace of his presence. "That's the peculiar thing, my lord," Mrs. Plackett explained. "When I went to clean his room this morning after hearing the dreadful news, everything was gone. Not just packed, gone, as if he'd never been here at all. Even the sheets had been stripped from the bed and bundled away." Wimsey examined the floorboards beneath the window, noting faint indentations that suggested the recent placement of an easel. So our young artist was indeed painting during his surveillance. Yet he removed not only the paintings but the easel itself, and apparently every trace of his artistic materials. He moved to the window, which commanded an excellent view of Thornwick Manor across the intervening fields. From this vantage point, one could observe not merely the manor's exterior, but the interior of any room with unshuttered windows, including the study with its large casements and Thornwick's preference for natural light. "Inspector," Wimsey said thoughtfully, "consider the curious choreography of last evening's events. Geoffrey receives a cryptic message about clean windows and hot ovens. He immediately begins packing with apparent urgency. Meanwhile, someone at the manor makes a breathing telephone call to test whether Higgins is at his post. The timing suggests coordination rather than coincidence." As they prepared to leave the Shepherd's Rest, Wimsey cast one final glance around Geoffrey's former room. The thoroughness of the cleanup, the precision of the surveillance notes, the carefully timed telephone calls, all pointed to a level of orchestration that seemed inconsistent with the impulsive violence of a family murder. "Inspector," he said finally, "I begin to suspect we are dealing with someone who has used our artistic nephew as what the theatrical profession would call a decoy, a performer whose obvious guilt serves to distract attention from the true drama. Being enacted elsewhere." He paused at the door, adjusting his monocle with the particular delicacy of a man who had noticed something others had missed. "The evidence against Geoffrey is almost too perfect, every clue carefully preserved, every suspicious action witnessed and remembered. It suggests a mind that understands not merely how to commit murder, but how to stage it for maximum effect." The afternoon light continued to fade beyond the small window, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the room's current emptiness. It was, Wimsey reflected, rather like examining a stage after the performance had ended. All the props removed, the actors departed, leaving only the faint traces of whatever drama had been enacted there. "Come," he said, gathering his coat with the air of a man who had learned something significant. "I believe it's time we returned to Thornwick Manor for a more detailed examination of the domestic arrangements. After all, if someone has taken such elaborate care to implicate young Geoffrey, they may have been equally careful to establish their own alibis. And in my experience, the most carefully constructed alibis are often the most revealing, particularly when they depend upon the precise manipulation of time, temperature, and domestic routine." As they departed the Shepherd's Rest, Wimsey found himself humming a tune with far too many accidentals to be respectable, while his mind worked over the curious problem of a murder that seemed almost too perfectly solved, and a murderer who appeared to have vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving behind only the carefully arranged evidence of someone else's guilt. The return to Thornwick Manor in the gathering dusk provided Wimsey with an opportunity to conduct what he privately termed domestic archaeology, the systematic excavation of a household's hidden rhythms and concealed mechanisms. The grey afternoon had deepened into premature twilight, lending the ancient house that particular quality of brooding expectancy, which he had learned to associate with secrets on the verge of revelation. "Inspector," he announced, consulting his pocket watch with the precision of a man for whom minutes had become as crucial as motives, I propose we approach this mystery not as a crime of passion, but as a problem in domestic engineering. Someone has taken considerable care to manipulate not merely the evidence, but the very fabric of this household's routine. Their first destination was the manor's heating plant. Housed in a low stone building that hummed with mechanical purpose, the air struck them like a physical blow, hot, damp, and redolent of coal smoke and metal polish. Crib, the elderly gardener whose face bore the weathered dignity of a man who had spent his life in communion with soil and seasons, regarded their arrival with the resignation of one who suspects his peaceful afternoon is about to be thoroughly disrupted. Fires banked at 9 o'clock, you said, Crib. Wimsey began examining the massive boiler with the attention of an antiquarian assessing a medieval manuscript. Aye, my lord. Best wig and coal banked proper for the night, enough to keep the water from sulking no more. Crib scratched behind his ear with the deliberate motion of a man choosing his words carefully. But that's the queer thing. Woke twice with the toothache I did, and heard the pipes singing like a choir of angels. First time was 11:30, quiet like just a whisper. But by midnight, they was clattering fit to wake the dead. Wimsey knelt beside the main valve, noting the telltale signs of recent adjustment. Fresh scratches on the brass, a slight misalignment that spoke of hurried manipulation. Someone opened the flow manually, overriding the normal controls. Bunter, what do you make of this valve assembly? Bunter examined the mechanism with his characteristic thoroughness. Modified, my lord. Someone has bypassed the thermostat entirely, allowing maximum flow regardless of temperature readings. The result would be tropical heating within a matter of hours. And here, Wimsey observed, touching a dark smear on the valve handle, we find our ubiquitous grease. Someone took considerable care to ensure silent operation, no squeaks or groans to alert the household to nocturnal tampering. Returning to the manor proper, Wimsey set about reconstructing the evening's chronology with the methodical precision of a Swiss clockmaker. He began in the entrance hall where the grandfather clock's solemn tick provided a temporal anchor for his calculations. Consider, Inspector, the curious mathematics of impossibility, he said, consulting his notebook. Geoffrey receives his cryptic message at 9:15. The breathing call to the manor occurs at 20 minutes past 9. Yet Mrs. Plackett assures us that Geoffrey had begun packing before his telephone rang. He moved to examine the hall console where the missing salver had once resided. From the Shepherd's Rest to Thornwick Manor, 1 mile and 3/4 cross-country, allowing for the necessity of remaining unobserved. At a young man's urgent pace, 45 minutes minimum. Yet if Geoffrey departed immediately after his call at 9:15, he could not have reached the manor grounds before 10 o'clock. Inspector Mellors frowned over his own calculations. But the murder occurred between midnight and 2 in the morning, according to Dr. Pemberton. Precisely, Inspector, which suggests either that Geoffrey possessed the gift of bilocation or that someone else was orchestrating events with remarkable precision while our artistic nephew served as an unwitting decoy. In the kitchen, Mrs. Dalrymple's routine provided crucial evidence of the evening's manipulated chronology. Wimsey examined the range with renewed interest, noting the coal scuttle's near emptiness and the telltale residue that spoke of intensive overnight burning. You banked the fires at 9 o'clock sharp, Mrs. Dalrymple? As I have every evening for 12 years, my lord. Stone cold when I left it, save for the day's residual warmth. Yet this morning, you found it burning with sufficient intensity to heat the entire household's water supply. Wimsey made a note in his leather book. Someone restoked it after your departure. Someone with intimate knowledge of your routine and access to the kitchen. He moved to the crystalline windows, whose impossible cleanliness continued to fascinate him. And these windows, cleaned yesterday afternoon, yet somehow even cleaner this morning. That's right, my lord. Almost as if someone had gone over them again during the night. Queer thing to do, if you ask me. Not queer at all, Mrs. Dalrymple, if one required an absolutely unobstructed view of something occurring in the study opposite. Someone needed to see clearly, not into the study, but out of it. Bunter's systematic search of the study had yielded the missing oval salver, discovered wedged behind the coal scuttle and bearing traces that told their own story. Wimsey examined it through his monocle with the attention of a scholar passing ancient text. Recently polished, yet bearing salt residue around the rim, he observed, and this faint chemical odor, turpentine mixed with something else, Our domestic engineer required this particular piece for some specific purpose, then concealed it where casual search would not reveal it. He knelt beside the study door, examining once more the curious dusting of salt along the skirting board. Salt, Inspector, reduces friction most admirably. It allows small objects to slide where they might otherwise catch or scrape. A trivial observation, yet one that suggests someone required something to pass beneath this door with absolute silence. Standing in the center of the study, Wimsey began to weave together the accumulated evidence into a coherent narrative of mechanical precision and domestic manipulation. "Observe the careful choreography. Inspector," he said, gesturing toward the modified radiator. "The heating system is sabotaged during the afternoon to ensure tropical temperatures by midnight. The kitchen range is restoked after Mrs. Dalrymple's departure to provide the necessary hot water. The curtains are drawn not to conceal activity within, but to trap heat and prevent observation from without." He moved to examine the window latches, noting again the telltale traces of grease. "These latches have been adjusted repeatedly, not to facilitate entry or exit, but to ensure they remain locked from the inside, creating the illusion of an impossible crime." Inspector Mellors studied the accumulated evidence with growing unease. "You're suggesting the murder was committed by someone who never entered the room?" "I'm suggesting something rather more intriguing, Inspector. I'm suggesting we're dealing with someone who understood that the most effective impossible lay. Crime is not truly impossible, merely made to appear so through the careful manipulation of physical laws and domestic routine." Wimsey's pale eyes brightened with that particular gleam that Bunter had learned to associate with approaching revelation. "Consider the telephone calls, precisely timed to establish Geoffrey's presence at the Shepherd's Rest, while creating the illusion of communication with the manor. Consider the evidence so carefully preserved, the painter's rag, the green scarf, the convenient witnesses. Consider the heating system, modified to create specific conditions at a specific time." He consulted his pocket watch once more, noting the advancing evening. "No, Inspector, we are not dealing with a crime of passion or family vengeance. We are dealing with someone who has turned this entire household into a vast mechanical device. A clockwork murder machine, if you will, designed to eliminate Cedric Thornwick, while ensuring that young Geoffrey would bear the blame." As they prepared to leave the study, Wimsey cast one final glance at the drawn curtains, the modified heating system, and the carefully arranged evidence. It was, he reflected, rather like examining the works of an extraordinarily complex timepiece, each component precisely calibrated to produce a specific result at a predetermined moment. "Come, Inspector," he said, gathering his coat with the air of a man who had seen enough for the present. "I believe it's time we conducted a small experiment in domestic physics. After all, the best way to understand how a clockwork murder operates is to wind it up and watch it tick." The evening shadows continued to lengthen beyond the study windows, while somewhere in the depths of the house, the modified heating system hummed with mechanical satisfaction, still maintaining the tropical warmth that had been so crucial to the murderer's precisely calculated plan. The experiment Lord Peter conducted at 10:30 possessed that peculiar quality of scientific inquiry that transforms domestic routine into criminal revelation. With Bunter's assistance, he had arranged the study precisely as it would have appeared on the fatal evening. Curtains drawn, radiator adjusted to maximum flow, and the missing oval salver positioned for what he privately termed mechanical archaeology. "Inspector," Wimsey announced, sprinkling a careful line of salt along the study door's threshold, "I propose to demonstrate how one might commit murder without ever entering the room where the victim lies. Observe the mathematics of impossibility made manifest." The salver, when dusted with salt and positioned at the precise angle Wimsey had calculated, slid beneath the door with barely a whisper of sound. A gentle pressure, applied with the delicacy of a surgeon, and the silver disc disappeared into the study beyond, carrying with it a small coal shovel borrowed from the grate. 3/8 of an inch clearance, Wimsey observed, consulting his pocket watch. "Sufficient for our purposes, provided one understands the lubricating properties of salt and possesses intimate knowledge of this particular door's peculiarities." The retrieval, accomplished with butcher's string and considerable patience, proved equally instructive. The salver emerged bearing its metallic passenger, the entire operation conducted with a silence that would not have disturbed a sleeping. Cat Detective Sergeant Parker's arrival from London brought with it a portfolio of discoveries that cast the entire affair in an increasingly theatrical light. His methodical investigation had uncovered a web of artistic intrigue that extended far beyond the domestic confines of Thornwick Manor. Geoffrey's Chelsea lodgings tell their own story. Peter, Parker reported, settling himself with the satisfaction of a man bearing significant intelligence. The studio had been systematically searched by someone seeking something specific, a well-dressed gentleman, whom the landlady observed departing with a large canvas wrapped in brown paper. The mysterious artwork that prompted Geoffrey's sudden departure, Wimsey mused. Most illuminating, and the gentleman's identity, unknown, but notable for his attention to cleanliness, gloves throughout his visit, wiping down every surface he touched. Professional caution, one might say. Parker's inquiries at Chelsea galleries had revealed Geoffrey's attempts to sell a portrait of disturbing psychological intensity, work that several dealers deemed beyond his usual capabilities. The technical execution suggested a more accomplished artist, while the subject matter possessed what one dealer described as genuinely unsettling qualities. The financial arrangements are equally intriguing, Parker continued. Cedric Thornwick had withdrawn £500 in cash over the past month, ostensibly for art acquisition, for though his banker noted unusual agitation during these transactions, it was Bunter's quiet investigation among the domestic staff that revealed perhaps the most significant discovery of all. Miss Evelyn Ashworth, Thornwick's secretary of 15 years, possessed what the parlour maid Mary described as a rather surprising hobby, amateur photography conducted with considerable technical sophistication. She has a particular interest in photographing the manor's interior, Bunter reported discreetly, especially fond of capturing specific lighting conditions using a flash apparatus that requires considerable electrical power. Wimsey's pale eyes sharpened with interest. And the manor's electrical system, Bunter. Robust enough for such demands, my lord. But the main circuit breaker is located in the boiler house, the very location of last evening's unusual heating activities. Miss Ashworth herself proved to be a woman of indeterminate age, dressed in practical tweeds with steel-grey hair arranged in a severe bun. Her movements possessed that precise efficiency of one who had spent decades managing the minutiae of another's life, while her pale eyes held an intelligence that seemed to catalogue every detail of their conversation. I merely facilitated Mr. Thornwick's work, she explained when questioned about her role in the household. He was a man of immense intellect, but sometimes overlooked the small details of daily life, such as his preference for natural light, Wimsey inquired, or his meticulous habits regarding curtains. A barely perceptible flicker crossed her composed features. Mr. Thornwick was very particular about his study. No one was to enter without his express permission. The discovery of Sir Charles Eastlake's materials for a history of oil, painting missing from Thornwick's mantelpiece, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Miss Pemberton's casual revelation that Thornwick had recently joined a London society devoted to art conservation and had received visits from one Mr. Vale, a very elegant gentleman with hands like a pianist, suggested connections that extended far beyond rural domesticity. Mr. Vale from Camden, Wimsey observed, noting the geographical coincidence with the mysterious telephone calls. How very convenient for our chronology. Parker's telegram, arriving with dramatic punctuality, confirmed these suspicions. Auctioneer Clark confirms. Thornwick consigned small old masters to Prospero Galleries under name Mr. Glass. Past 6 months stop restoration work attributed to a Vale Camden studio. Stop canvases in question stylistically inconsistent suggest interference. Stop Mr. Glass, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. The modesty of aliases. Our Mr. Thornwick was apparently fond of transparency in his pseudonyms, if not in his business practices. The heating system's modification revealed a level of technical sophistication that spoke of considerable planning and expertise. Bunter's examination showed professional installation, requiring specialized tools and intimate knowledge of the manor's infrastructure. The work was completed at least a week ago, Bunter reported, well before Geoffrey began his surveillance, yet precisely coordinated with his eventual arrival at the Shepherd's Rest. Wimsey consulted his pocket watch, noting the advancing evening. Someone has been orchestrating this drama with remarkable foresight, Inspector. The question remains, who possessed both the technical knowledge to modify the heating system and the intimate familiarity with household routine necessary to coordinate such precise timing? As the evidence accumulated, it became increasingly apparent that they were dealing with a crime rooted not in passion or greed, but in something far more complex, a psychological manipulation of extraordinary sophistication. "Consider the curious choreography, Inspector," Wimsey observed. "Geoffrey receives cryptic messages about clean windows and hot ovens. The heating system is sabotaged to create tropical conditions at precisely the right moment. The curtains are drawn not to conceal activity within, but to create specific atmospheric conditions. Even the missing salver serves a purpose in this elaborate mechanical ballet." He moved to examine once more the crystalline kitchen windows that had first attracted his attention. Someone required an absolutely unobstructed view between these rooms, not to observe Thornwick's activities, but to ensure perfect timing for whatever mechanism they had devised. Miss Ashworth, when pressed about her photographic activities, admitted to having documented Thornwick's destroyed portraits. "It was for posterity," she explained quietly, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "And the missing salver?" Wimsey inquired gently. "It was for the salt," she whispered, a single tear tracking down her pale cheek. "To keep the light pure for the photographs." As the evening deepened around Thornwick Manor, Wimsey found himself confronting a crime of extraordinary complexity, one that had transformed the entire household into a vast mechanical device designed to eliminate Cedric Thornwick while ensuring that Geoffrey would bear the blame. "No, Inspector," he said finally, "we are not dealing with a simple case of family murder. We are dealing with someone who has committed what I can only describe as mechanical homicide, a crime executed not by human hand, but by the careful manipulation of physical laws, domestic routine, and human psychology." The shadows continued to lengthen beyond the study windows, while somewhere in the depths of the house, the modified heating system maintained its mechanical rhythm, still operating according to the precise calculations that had made murder not merely possible, but inevitable. "Tomorrow," Wimsey announced, gathering his coat with the air of a man who had finally grasped the essential nature of the problem before him, "we shall conduct a more comprehensive demonstration. After all, the best way to catch a mechanical murderer is to understand exactly how their infernal device operates, and more importantly, who possessed both the knowledge and the obsession necessary to construct such an elaborate engine of death." As they prepared to retire for the evening, Wimsey cast one final glance at the study's drawn curtains, behind which lay not merely the scene of a crime, but the stage for what was rapidly revealing itself to be one of the most psychologically complex murders he had ever encountered. It was, he reflected, rather like examining a photograph in which the obvious subject concealed a more disturbing image, visible only to those with the patience to develop the negative properly. By morning, the village had adjusted itself to the murder with that peculiar resilience of English rural communities, stiffly, with considerable murmuring, but resigned to the disruption of their ordinary peace. Wimsey, however, preferred to begin the day with corrected data, having observed that crimes like Latin elegiacs were rendered nonsensical by the slightest false quantity. Miss Postlethwaite arrived bearing her ledger with the ceremonial gravity of a priest carrying sacred relics, her steel-grey hair arranged with military precision and her pale eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of one who possessed crucial intelligence. "I must offer a correction. Lord Peter," she announced with the austere satisfaction of one about to set the universe right upon its axis. "Yesterday's call at 20 minutes past 9, I stated it originated from Camden. That was imprecise. The call connected to Camden, certainly, but the initiation was local. Thornwick Exchange placed the call at 19 minutes past 9, with Camden merely accepting the connection." Inspector Mellors looked up sharply from his notebook. "So our mysterious caller wasn't in London at all?" "Indeed not, Inspector. The speaking party, whispering most peculiarly, was on our local line. I have the trunk notations to prove it. She consulted her ledger with reverent precision, which means someone in Thornwick Village was pretending to call from London while simultaneously making that breathing call to the manor. Wimsey adjusted his monocle with evident satisfaction. How illuminating, Miss Postlethwaite. Our sighing phantom not only breathed ominously for Higgins' benefit, but also conducted a rather elaborate charade of long-distance communication. Accuracy, as I always maintain, is the politest form of charity. Their next revelation came from young Tom Wicket, the grocer's boy, whose thatch of unruly hair and expression of earnest concern suggested he bore intelligence of considerable import. Miss Ashworth sent me on an errand yesterday afternoon. My lord, he confessed, twisting his cap with nervous energy. Wanted ice from Mr. Hobson's fish rooms, 2 blocks wrapped in sacking. Told me to take them round by the scullery door and not to bother cook with it. Mrs. Dalrymple, when confronted with this intelligence, stiffened from apron to cap with righteous indignation. Ice in March, my lord? And no one consulted me about it. There'll be a proper reckoning about staff conducting their own business through my scullery. Mary, the parlour-maid, provided the next crucial thread with trembling pink cheeks. Miss Ashworth asked me for salt, my lord, a whole basin of it. Said it was for cleaning silver before photographing the account ledgers, to keep the light pure. I shouldn't have obliged her without asking cook, but she seemed so particular about Mr. Thornwick's requirements. And where did this alchemical union of salt and ice occur? Wimsey inquired with growing interest. In the scullery sink, my lord. She had me pour the salt over the ice and stir it with the silver spoon from the oval salver. Only the spoon's a bit bent now, and the felt underneath has gone missing. Bunter's systematic examination of the recovered salver revealed traces that told their own precise story. The silver surface bore residue of fine table salt, mixed with what his trained nose identified as photographic chemicals, specifically the acrid remnants of pyrogallic acid solution, an older type of developer known for its powerful solvent properties. The combination would create a freezing bath. My lord, Bunter reported with his customary discretion, salt and ice together produce temperatures well below freezing, sufficient to chill any liquid to an extraordinary degree within minutes. Wimsey made careful notes in his leather book. So our cold milk was not merely the result of overnight cooling, but of deliberate chemical manipulation. Someone required it to be significantly colder than natural circumstances would produce. The kitchen windows, whose impossible cleanliness had first attracted Wimsey's attention, yielded additional secrets under systematic examination. Using a small specialized light meter from his collection of investigative instruments, he detected traces of ammonia, a cleaning agent Mrs. Dalrymple swore she never employed. Ammonia leaves streaks. My lord, she insisted with professional pride, I use nothing but soap, water, and a drop of vinegar for the shine. Have done for 12 years running. Then someone else provided these windows with their final polish, Wimsey observed. Someone who required not merely cleanliness, but optical perfection for a specific purpose. Ammonia, while harsh, does provide exceptional clarity when properly applied. In the study itself, Wimsey's attention was drawn to a detail so subtle that even his trained observation had initially overlooked it. The heavy curtains, drawn against Thornwick's usual preference for natural light, bore their own tale of manipulation. Higgins, he called to the butler, in what position did Mr. Thornwick prefer the curtain tassel? Always on the left side, my lord, by specific instruction. He said the light fell better that way and preferred the drape, yet it hangs on the right at present, Wimsey observed, which suggests someone unfamiliar with his particular preferences drew these curtains, someone who understood the necessity of blocking the light, but not the domestic tyrannies that governed its usual arrangement. When pressed for additional details about the evening in question, Mary provided what proved to be perhaps the most significant observation of all. When I glimpsed the study at 8:30, my lord, I noticed something peculiar about the window. Just a sliver of light along the edge, as if the curtain wasn't quite closed properly, or... She hesitated, her brow furrowed in concentration. Or perhaps a window was slightly ajar. Wimsey suggested gently, Yes, my lord, just a crack, as if it had been opened briefly and then shut again. I dismissed it at the time, thinking it was merely light catching the glass. But now that you mention it, not dismissed. Mary merely filed away until its significance became apparent, Wimsey assured her. A most valuable observation indeed. Dr. Pemberton's arrival brought additional confirmation of the evening's careful orchestration. His re-examination of the wound revealed traces of linseed oil clinging to Thornwick's hair, a detail that had initially suggested artistic materials but now pointed to something more specific. "The resinous odor is quite distinct," the doctor reported. "Not merely turpentine, but the particular blend used in art restoration, linseed oil mixed with specific solvents for cleaning old varnishes." Bunter's discovery of a small nick on one of the study's grotesque bookends provided another piece of the puzzle. The fresh chip in the bronze suggested recent impact, while traces of the same chemical mixture found throughout the crime scene clung to the damaged area. Throughout these revelations, Miss Ashworth maintained her composure with the practiced skill of one who had spent 15 years managing domestic crises. Yet Wimsey's pale eyes detected the subtle signs of increasing strain, the slight tremor in her hands when handling documents, the barely perceptible hesitation before answering questions, the way her gaze avoided direct contact with the accumulating evidence. "The photographic work you mentioned, Miss Ashworth," Wimsey said with deceptive casualness, "it required specific lighting conditions, I presume." "Natural light is always preferable for detailed documentation," she replied, her voice steady but somehow lacking its usual confidence, "though I occasionally employ flash apparatus for subjects in shadow. And the electrical demands of such equipment? Considerable, I imagine." "The Manor's electrical system is quite robust. Lord Peter, Mr. Thornwick ensured all modern conveniences were properly installed. As the morning's investigations continued, a picture emerged of domestic arrangements manipulated with scientific precision. The heating system's modification, the restoked kitchen range, the chemically treated ice, the perfectly cleaned windows, each element suggested a mind that understood not merely how to commit murder, but how to stage it with mechanical exactitude. "Inspector," Wimsey observed, consulting his pocket watch with the precision of a man for whom minutes had become as crucial as motives, "we are dealing with someone who has transformed this entire household into a vast clockwork device, each component calibrated to produce a specific result at a predetermined moment." He moved to examine once more the study window, now open to the grey morning air, the slightly ajar window that Mary observed, the salt beneath the door, the modified heating system, the chilled milk, all point to a crime that required not merely opportunity and motive, but extraordinary technical sophistication. As the evidence accumulated with inexorable precision, Wimsey found himself confronting a murder of remarkable complexity, one that had required months of preparation, intimate knowledge of household routine, and access to both technical expertise and specialized equipment. "No, Inspector," he said finally, "this was not a crime of passion or family vengeance. We are dealing with someone who has committed what I can only describe as mechanical homicide, a murder executed not by human hand alone, but by the careful manipulation of physical laws, domestic routine, and human psychology." The grey morning light continued to filter through the perfectly cleaned windows, illuminating what was rapidly revealing itself to be not merely a crime scene, but the stage for one of the most ingeniously conceived murders Wimsey had ever encountered. It was, he reflected, rather like examining a photograph, where the obvious composition concealed a more complex image visible only to those with the patience and expertise to develop the negative properly. "Tomorrow evening," he announced, gathering his coat with the air of a man who had finally grasped the essential nature of the problem before him, "I shall require the presence of all concerned parties for a small demonstration. After all, the most effective way to expose a mechanical murderer is to understand precisely how their infernal device operates, and more importantly, to identify who possessed both the knowledge and the obsession necessary to construct such an elaborate engine of death." As they prepared to leave the manor, Wimsey cast one final glance at the study's drawn curtains, behind which lay not merely the scene of a crime, but evidence of what was proving to be one of the most psychologically and technically sophisticated murders in his considerable experience. The game, as he was fond of observing, was definitely afoot. At 11:09 on the following evening, the household assembled in the long gallery with that particular mixture of dread and anticipation which characterizes Audiences awaiting a performance whose conclusion they suspect will prove more illuminating than comfortable. The lamps had been dimmed at Lord Peter's request, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the proceedings, while the portrait of an 18th-century Thornwick regarded the company with hereditary hauteur. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wimsey began, his voice carrying that note of theatrical precision which Bunter had learned to associate with approaching revelation, "I must beg your indulgence for what may seem an impertinence to domestic tranquility. However, if the dead are to be properly respected, they must first be accurately understood." He gestured toward Mrs. Dalrymple, who approached with the dignity of an officiating priestess, bearing a basin of salt. Bunter followed with 2 blocks of ice wrapped in sacking and the recovered oval salver, its silver surface gleaming with the innocent brilliance of honest metal, unaware of its promotion to chief conspirator. "We shall reproduce," Wimsey announced, with scientific fidelity, the domestic alchemy that made murder not merely possible, but mechanically inevitable. In the scullery, Mary poured salt over the ice with trembling hands, while Bunter stirred the mixture with the bent silver spoon. A crystalline fog bloomed immediately, and Mrs. Dalrymple uttered an involuntary exclamation as frost formed along the basin's rim. "Observe, Inspector," Wimsey said, placing a thermometer in a small jug of milk, "how rapidly the temperature descends. Milk thus treated will retain its Arctic chill for hours. Even in the most tropical atmosphere, a crucial detail for establishing the precise chronology of our domestic drama." As the mercury plummeted, Wimsey continued his preparations. "Mr. Cribb, if you would be so good as to open the main heating valve to its maximum indiscretion. Mrs. Dalrymple has kindly arranged for the kitchen range to burn with Babylonian enthusiasm, ensuring our thermal conditions match those of the fatal evening." Returning to the study, Wimsey arranged his materials with surgical precision. The room had been heated to tropical intensity, the curtains drawn exactly as they had been found, and the oval salver positioned for its sinister purpose. "The genius of this crime," Wimsey explained, sprinkling salt along the door's threshold, "lies not in its complexity, but in its mechanical precision. Observe how salt eliminates friction, allowing objects to move with absolute silence." The salver slid beneath the door like a cat on polished marble. Upon it rested not merely a coal shovel, but a carefully constructed apparatus, a length of strong cord attached to the shovel's handle, with a second, finer line connected to a small wooden peg. From outside this locked room, Wimsey demonstrated, one may introduce a weighted implement, position it with mathematical accuracy, and at precisely the calculated moment, deliver a blow of devastating force. He manipulated the cords with the delicacy of a surgeon. The coal shovel, guided by the peg's orientation, swept across the floor in a calculated arc, striking a stuffed dummy positioned where Thornwick would have sat. The impact was both silent and decisive. "And now the truly elegant aspect," Wimsey continued, reversing his manipulation. "The weapon returns to its innocent position. The guiding peg is withdrawn, and the salver slides back beneath the door, carrying with it all evidence of the mechanical intervention." Inspector Mellors examined the dummy, noting the precise nature of the simulated wound. But how could anyone predict the victim's exact position? "Through systematic observation, Inspector. Someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Thornwick's evening habits, combined with photographic documentation of his precise routine." Miss Ashworth, who had maintained her composure throughout the demonstration, finally spoke with quiet dignity. "You have proven the method possible, Lord Peter, but you have not yet established the motive. Haven't I, Miss Ashworth?" Wimsey's pale eyes fixed upon her with gentle precision. "Your photographic work, your access to the heating system, your knowledge of domestic chemistry, your connection to the London art world through your restoration work with Mr. Vale, all point to someone with both the technical expertise and the professional motivation for such an elaborate crime." He moved to the mantelpiece, where the gap left by the missing volume seemed to mock the surrounding collection. Cedric Thornwick was not merely selling his collection, was he? He was commissioning forgeries, replacing authentic works with copies and selling the originals under assumed names. Your 15 years of cataloging and preservation made you uniquely qualified to recognize the systematic destruction of artistic heritage. Miss Ashworth's hands trembled as she spoke. "He was destroying everything I had spent my life protecting. The forgeries were becoming more sophisticated, the documentation more falsified. Geoffrey's portraits weren't of people. They were detailed studies of the work Cedric was replacing with copies. Her voice gained strength as the burden of secrecy lifted. Geoffrey discovered the scheme and threatened exposure. Cedric would have destroyed not only Geoffrey's career, but the historical record itself. I couldn't allow that to happen. The telephone calls, Wimsey observed, were designed to establish Geoffrey's presence at the Shepherd's Rest, while creating the illusion of external communication. You placed the local call, connecting through Camden to reinforce the London connection, then made the breathing call to test Higgins's position. He consulted his pocket watch with ceremonial precision. The ice and salt were for the milk, a chemical signature that would provide temporal evidence of the crime's mechanical nature. The heating system was modified to create the precise, atmospheric conditions necessary for your apparatus to function with chronometer accuracy. Miss Ashworth rose with the dignity of one whose professional integrity had finally been vindicated. I regret the deception regarding Geoffrey, but I could not allow 15 years of careful preservation to be destroyed by one man's greed. The artworks, the historical record, the truth itself, all were more important than one life, even my own. Inspector Mellors stepped forward with professional courtesy. Miss Evelyn Ashworth, I arrest you for the murder of Cedric Thornwick. As the company dispersed into the grey evening, Wimsey remained in the study, contemplating the scene of what had proved to be one of the most ingeniously conceived murders in his considerable experience. Bunter, he said finally, there is something rather satisfying about a crime that operates with mechanical precision, provided, of course, that one possesses the intellectual curiosity to understand its workings. Miss Ashworth created not merely a murder, but a work of domestic engineering that would have done credit to a master clockmaker. He gathered his coat with the air of a man whose professional curiosity had been thoroughly satisfied. It is, I suppose, fitting that someone who devoted her life to preserving artistic truth should commit her crime with such technical artistry. One can only regret that her considerable talents were not applied to more constructive purposes. The evening shadows lengthened beyond the study windows as the heating system continued its mechanical rhythm, still operating according to the precise calculations that had made murder not merely possible, but inevitable, until someone had possessed the wit to understand exactly how the infernal clockwork operated, and, more importantly, who had wound it with such deadly precision. Come, Bunter, Wimsey said, adjusting his monocle with that particular delicacy reserved for the conclusion of intellectually satisfying cases. I believe our work here is complete. After all, the most elegant crimes, like the finest timepieces, reveal their true beauty only to those with the patience to examine their inner mechanisms. The drawing-room of Thornwick Manor possessed that peculiar quality of spaces where truth has recently been unveiled, a sort of breathless quiet, as if the very furniture were digesting the implications of what had transpired. Miss Ashworth remained seated with her hands folded in her lap, displaying that particular composure of one who has finally set down a burden carried too long in solitude. Her steel-grey hair maintained its customary precision despite the evening's revelations, while her pale eyes held a curious mixture of relief and something approaching satisfaction. There remains, Wimsey observed, settling himself with the careful attention of a man who understood that conclusions, like fine vintages, required proper presentation, the matter of certain documentary evidence which may illuminate the full scope of Miss Ashworth's remarkable achievement. He gestured toward Bunter, who approached with his customary discretion, bearing a shallow leather case retrieved from the ebony cabinet. When opened, it revealed an array of glass photographic plates, each labeled in Miss Ashworth's precise handwriting. Study, 8:30 p.m., curtain positioning noted. Study, 9:05 p.m., easel moved to corner. Study, 10:47 p.m., window ajar, latch positions documented. Mrs. Dalrymple crossed herself with instinctive piety. Photographs of his wickedness, she murmured, like keeping ledgers in perdition. Miss Ashworth regarded the plates with the detached precision of a scholar examining manuscripts. I required accurate documentation, she said quietly. When men construct elaborate deceptions, photographs do not lie. The windows must be perfectly clean to capture truth. Inspector Mellors consulted his notebook, with growing comprehension. These plates show you documented every detail of the room's arrangement over several weeks. 15 years of managing this household taught me more than correspondence and cataloguing. Miss Ashworth replied with quiet dignity. When heating systems failed, or electrical circuits required attention, one could not always await professional assistance. I learned to observe, to measure, to calculate with precision. Wimsey examined the plates through his monocle, noting their systematic progression. The genius lies not merely in the mechanical execution, but in the methodical preparation. Each photograph represents a piece of a vast clockwork mechanism, calibrated to produce murder with the reliability of a Swiss timepiece. He moved to the study window, adjusting the latch with particular attention. The window positioning documented here shows your understanding that even the slightest mechanical variation could disrupt the entire enterprise. Yet there was one detail you could not have anticipated: Mr. Thornwick's decision to replace his chair cushion the week before his death. Miss Ashworth's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. The springs had begun to squeak. He mentioned it disturbed his concentration during evening work. Precisely. That single domestic alteration, raising his seated position by perhaps an inch, caused your carefully calculated blow to strike the bronze grotesque rather than achieving the clean result you had engineered. The resinous traces Dr. Pemberton discovered were not from artistic materials, but from your restoration work, linseed oil and specialized solvents used in conservation. Mary, whose pink cheeks had grown increasingly pale throughout the evening's revelations, found her voice at last. Miss Ashworth, when you asked me for that basin of salt when I helped you with the ice, did you never consider how we'd feel, knowing we'd assisted, even unknowing? The secretary's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. I told myself that your innocence would protect you, that if you truly didn't understand, you bore no responsibility for the outcome. But we'll remember now, won't we? Mary whispered. Every time I measure salt or polish silver, I'll recall what it helped accomplish. Higgins, whose 20 years of service had been built upon assumptions of domestic stability and moral certainty, spoke with the dignity of a man whose world had been fundamentally altered. In all our years working together, Miss Ashworth, I believed I understood your character. How long had you been planning this arrangement? The technical preparations began 6 months ago, she replied with quiet precision. But the moral preparation, the recognition that Cedric's activities constituted cultural murder, had been building for years. Every forged provenance, every authentic work replaced by clever copies, every lie told to collectors and scholars, it was death by degrees to everything I held sacred. A commotion in the entrance hall announced the arrival of Geoffrey Thornwick, escorted by a constable and bearing the rumpled, bewildered appearance of one who had been dragged through his own melodrama, only to discover the script entirely rewritten. I didn't, he began immediately, before anyone could formulate the conventional opening for meaningfully guilty nephews. I didn't do anything except sketch windows and attempt rational conversation with my uncle. Mrs. Plackett said something about packing, then the police arrived. Good Lord, is that Miss Ashworth? What have they accused you of? Miss Ashworth regarded him with unexpected gentleness. I have been arranging domestic matters, Geoffrey. I am quite accomplished at domestic arrangements. Wimsey gestured for the young man to sit. Your surveillance activities, Geoffrey, while genuine in intent, served an entirely different purpose than you imagined. Your sketches, your visible presence in the village, your distinctive green scarf, all provided the perfect foundation for a narrative of guilt. That would satisfy even the most skeptical investigator. Geoffrey focused on something comprehensible with visible relief. The window sketches. I noted that the inner latch had been adjusted recently. Uncle despised squeaking hinges. Precisely, Wimsey observed with satisfaction. That tiny domestic tyranny, the squeaking latch, disrupted Miss Ashworth's calculations by altering the window's opening angle. The blow struck half an inch from its intended target, which is why we discovered evidence on the bronze bookend rather than upon our obliging coal shovel. Dr. Pemberton, whose professional duties extended beyond the merely medical, addressed Miss Ashworth with grave concern. Was the preservation of these artworks truly worth a human life? The question hung in the air with the weight of final judgment. Miss Ashworth rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening moor with the distant expression of one who had wrestled with conscience and emerged with unshakable conviction. "Dr. Pemberton, you heal individual lives, and that is noble work. But Cedric was systematically destroying irreplaceable cultural heritage, works that had survived centuries of war, revolution, and neglect, only to be sacrificed to gambling debts and personal vanity." Her voice gained strength as the burden of secrecy lifted. The forgeries were becoming more sophisticated, the documentation more falsified. In 5 years, perhaps 10, there would have been nothing left but lies masquerading as history. How many future scholars would be deceived? How many students would build their understanding upon foundations of deliberate falsehood? "The fascinating aspect," Wimsey observed, his voice carrying that note of detached analysis which others sometimes found unsettling, "is how Miss Ashworth managed to transform an entire household into a philosophical argument expressed in mechanical terms." He moved through the study, touching various elements of the crime scene with scholarly precision. The tropical heat represented the fevered corruption of artistic integrity, while the Arctic milk suggested the cold precision of justice. Even the salt beneath the door carried symbolic weight, the biblical association with preservation and purification. Miss Ashworth turned from the window with something approaching gratitude. "You understand, then? It wasn't merely murder. It was a restoration of moral order, accomplished through the same methodical precision I brought to 15 years of conservation work." Inspector Mellors consulted his pocket watch with the air of a man whose duty, however unpleasant, could no longer be postponed. "Miss Ashworth, we must depart for the station. The magistrate will require your formal statement in the morning." She nodded with quiet dignity, gathering her coat with the same methodical precision she had brought to decades of domestic management. "Inspector, might I request one final moment in the study? There are certain professional matters I should like to set in order." "I'm afraid that's not possible, miss. The room remains part of the investigation." As the small procession prepared to depart, Miss Ashworth paused in the entrance hall, her pale eyes taking in the familiar surroundings with the careful attention of one who understood she was seeing them for the final time. "Lord Peter," she said quietly, "I hope you will not judge me too harshly. I acted not from malice, but from conviction that some things transcend individual existence. Truth, beauty, the preservation of cultural heritage for generations yet unborn." Wimsey regarded her with that particular mixture of intellectual appreciation and moral complexity which characterized his approach to the more philosophically challenging criminals he encountered. "Miss Ashworth," he replied with gentle precision, "I find myself in the curious position of admiring your technical achievement while deploring your moral reasoning. It is, I suppose, the eternal dilemma of those who encounter artistry in service of questionable ends." As the police vehicle departed into the grey evening, carrying with it the most technically accomplished murderer Wimsey had encountered in considerable time, he remained in the study, contemplating the scene with scholarly detachment, done credit to a master clockmaker. He moved to the window, adjusting the latch to its proper position with scrupulous care. Windows and ovens, ice and salt, heat and cold, a small domestic liturgy of death. They seek out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search. Both the inward thought of every one of them and the heart is deep. Psalm 64. "My lord," Bunter observed from behind him. "Because someone ought to know." "Thank you, Bunter. I detest misquotation." Wimsey touched the window lightly, as one might touch a scientific instrument before returning it to storage. The most elegant crimes, like the finest timepieces, reveal their true beauty only to those with patience to examine their inner mechanisms. The manor settled into uneasy quiet, its mechanical systems continuing their appointed rounds with the indifference of clockwork to human drama. In the study, the radiator maintained its steady warmth. The windows reflected the evening sky with crystalline clarity, and somewhere in the house's depths, the kitchen range burned with civilized constancy, all blissfully unaware of their brief conscription into service of murder most methodical. The morning after Miss Ashworth's arrest possessed that peculiar quality of light which follows the resolution of domestic mysteries, cleaner somehow, as if the very atmosphere had been purged of deception and mechanical malice. Lord Peter found himself contemplating his breakfast with the detached satisfaction of a scholar who had successfully passed a particularly complex Latin inscription. Though in this case the text had been written in salt, ice, and human blood. Detective Sergeant Parker arrived from town bearing a leather portfolio that seemed to contain half of London's art world, neatly catalogued and thoroughly disgraced. He settled himself with the air of a man whose methodical investigation had uncovered depths of corruption that would require considerable untangling. The Prospero Gallery connection runs deeper than we suspected, Peter, he reported, spreading documents across the breakfast table with systematic precision. Your Mr. Vale, real name Arthur Valesco, has been singing arias of confession since yesterday evening. The operation was international in scope, with tentacles reaching from Chelsea to Amsterdam. Wimsey adjusted his monocle with evident satisfaction. And the recovered works? Seven authentic pieces retrieved from a lockup in Camden, including 2 small Dutch panels and a Spanish devotional head that the Prado has been seeking for 3 years. Thornwick's copies were masterful, until one applied scientific analysis to the paint composition and canvas dating. Parker consulted his notebook with professional thoroughness. Valesco admits to the restoration work, but claims ignorance of the substitution scheme. However, his workshop contained detailed photographs of the originals alongside technical notes in Miss Ashworth's handwriting. She had been documenting the entire operation for months, apparently building a comprehensive case for exposure. The morning's second revelation came via Inspector Mellors, who arrived bearing news of Miss Ashworth's formal statement, a document that proved as methodically precise as her murder technique. "She's confessed fully, my lord," Mellors reported with professional satisfaction, tempered by evident unease. "But there's something unsettling about her composure. She speaks of the crime as if it were a conservation project that required unfortunate but necessary measures." Miss Ashworth's statement, when read aloud, possessed the clinical precision of a scientific paper. "I acted with full understanding of the consequences. Mr. Thornwick's activities constituted cultural vandalism on an international scale. The destruction of artistic heritage for personal gain is a crime against civilization itself. I weighed one life against the preservation of centuries of human achievement. My conscience remains clear. She offered to demonstrate the mechanical apparatus for the court's benefit," Mellors added with visible discomfort, as if murder were merely an engineering problem requiring technical explanation. Young Geoffrey appeared for what he announced would be his final breakfast at Thornwick Manor, bearing the subdued dignity of one whose world had been thoroughly rearranged by revelation. The inheritance brought complications, legal battles over authentication, insurance investigations, and the delicate matter of distinguishing forgeries from authentic works. "Lord Peter," he said, settling himself with careful movements, "I've been thinking about what Miss Ashworth said, about arrangement being dangerous. I believe I understand now. Art isn't merely about seeing differently, but about seeing truthfully." He produced a modest canvas from beneath his chair, a still life of the kitchen range, painted from memory, capturing not merely the physical details, but something of the moral weight the domestic space had acquired. "I thought I was watching windows to understand light and shadow. It turns out I was documenting the stage for murder." Wimsey examined the painting with genuine interest. "You've captured something essential, Geoffrey. The moral temperature of the room, one might say. Continue painting your own windows, but occupy yourself with keeping them clean for honest light." That afternoon, Wimsey fulfilled his original purpose in visiting Thornwick Abbas, making his way to the ancient church with Parker in companionable attendance. The small building received them with the patient dignity of stones that had witnessed centuries of human folly and redemption. "Gulielmus Faber," Wimsey wrote with careful precision, correcting the medieval inscription, "the craftsman, not the artist. There is a distinction upon which whole civilizations depend." "Rather like Miss Ashworth," Parker observed quietly. "Precisely like Miss Ashworth," Wimsey agreed, setting down his pen. She possessed extraordinary craft in service of what she believed to be art. The tragedy lies not merely in murder, but in the waste of such methodical genius applied to vigilante justice. The Red Lion that evening buzzed with the peculiar energy of a community digesting scandal. Mrs. Dalrymple held court near the fire, declaring with perverse pride that her kitchen had been the stage for the most sophisticated murder in Yorkshire's recent memory. "She knew my routines better than I knew them myself," she announced to anyone within earshot. "A true professional, even if she was a murderess." Miss Postlethwaite arrived bearing her ledger and a final correction. The mysterious breathing call had lasted not 10 seconds, but 12, according to a notation discovered wedged behind the exchange door. "I cannot abide sloppiness," she declared with ecclesiastical firmness, as if the universe's moral order depended upon temporal precision. As evening settled over Thornwick Manor, Wimsey found himself in the study one final time, contemplating the scene where domestic routine had been transformed into mechanical murder. The radiator hummed at a morally appropriate temperature, the curtains hung with their tassel properly positioned, and the bronze grotesques supported merely innocent volumes whose only secret was accumulated dust. The fascinating aspect, "Inspector," he observed to Mellors, "is how Miss Ashworth managed to transform an entire household into a philosophical argument expressed in mechanical terms. She created not merely a murder, but a work of domestic engineering that challenged our assumptions about justice, preservation, and the relative value of individual life versus cultural heritage." He gathered his coat with ceremonial precision. As their motor drew away from Thornwick Manor, Wimsey reflected on the curious satisfaction of having solved a murder that challenged not merely intellectual capacity, but moral understanding. The grey countryside rolled past with the indifference of landscape to human drama, while behind them the manor settled into its clockwork routine, pipes humming contentedly, windows reflecting honest sky, the domestic machinery purged of its brief conscription to murder. An elegant crime. "Bunter," Wimsey observed finally, committed by someone who understood that the most effective impossible murders are not truly impossible, merely made to appear so through the careful manipulation of physical laws and human psychology. "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied with his customary discretion, though one might observe that elegance in crime, like beauty in art, depends rather heavily upon one's moral perspective. "Quite so, Bunter. Quid latet apparebit. Whatever is hidden shall be revealed. Though sometimes upon revelation, one discovers that the hidden mechanisms serve purposes far more complex than mere timekeeping." As they departed Thornwick Abbas, Lord Peter found himself humming a fragment of Purcell, while his mind already turned toward London and the comfortable certainties of his club, where murders remained safely confined to the pages of sensation novels, and domestic arrangements served no purpose more sinister than the proper preparation of tea. The case would provide material for considerable reflection. ABC reminder that beneath the veneer of English respectability, the most methodical devotion to duty could, under sufficient moral pressure, transform itself into something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. It was, he reflected, rather like examining a photograph where the obvious composition concealed a more disturbing image, visible only to those with the patience and expertise to develop the negative with proper chemical precision. The clean windows of Thornwick Manor continued to reflect the honest sky, while somewhere in the county jail, Miss Ashworth no doubt maintained her conviction that some things transcended individual existence, and that truth, however mechanically achieved, justified whatever sacrifices it required. The domestic machinery of justice would now take its course, with the same inexorable precision she had brought to murder, though perhaps, Wimsey mused, with rather less artistic flair. A month had passed since Miss Ashworth's arrest, and London had resumed its customary indifference to provincial scandals with that peculiar resilience which enables the metropolis to digest even the most extraordinary revelations and transform them into mere conversational seasoning. Lord Peter, ensconced in his club library with the Times spread before him like a map of civilization's daily follies, found himself in receipt of correspondence that promised to add several footnotes to what he had begun to think of as the Thornwick Theorem. The first letter arrived on prison notepaper, written in Miss Ashworth's characteristically precise hand, a document that proved as methodically detailed as her approach to murder had been. "Lord Peter," it began with professional courtesy, "I write to offer certain technical corrections to your otherwise admirable reconstruction. The coal shovel was not my initial choice of implement. I had calculated trajectories for a silver-plated candlestick, but its weight distribution proved inadequate for the required precision. The shovel's center of gravity was mathematically ideal, though aesthetically less satisfying." Wimsey adjusted his monocle with evident appreciation. Even incarcerated, Miss Ashworth maintained her devotion to accuracy, a trait he found simultaneously admirable and chilling. "You correctly identified the window positioning as disruptive to my calculations," the letter continued, "but overlooked the felt padding's acoustic function. It dampened metallic resonance that might have alerted Higgins during his rounds. I had tested the sound properties extensively, patience being essential to proper domestic engineering." Detective Sergeant Parker's arrival interrupted Wimsey's scholarly appreciation of criminal precision. He settled himself with the satisfaction of a man whose methodical investigation had uncovered corruption on an international scale. "The Prospero Gallery network has collapsed entirely," Parker reported, consulting his notebook with professional thoroughness. "Valesco has provided documentation for over 40 substituted works. Museums across Europe are quietly conducting authentication reviews. The scandal, if fully publicized, would reshape the entire art market." And Miss Ashworth's cooperation in this exposure? Remarkably comprehensive. She treats it as a final conservation project, approaching the documentation with the same systematic precision she brought to murder. The prison governor describes her as the most methodically helpful prisoner in his considerable experience. Wimsey made careful notes in his leather book. So our mechanical murderess continues her preservation work, even from behind bars. There is something almost admirable in such consistency of purpose. News from Thornwick Abbas arrived through various channels, each correspondent adding their particular perspective to the domestic aftermath. Higgins had accepted a position with a smaller establishment, whereas Mrs. Dalrymple reported, "Stability has the courtesy to be unexciting." Mary had departed for her married sister's house in Harrogate, carrying with her what Cook described as a sensible complexion and an increased resolution to ask before handing basins of salt to anybody. Mrs. Dalrymple herself remained in proud possession of her kitchen kingdom, having achieved local celebrity status through her detailed recitations of the ranger's role in the mechanical murder. "She understood my routines better than I understood them myself," had become her standard conclusion to these performances, delivered with the satisfaction of one whose professional competence had been recognized. However criminally, Geoffrey had established himself in modest Chelsea lodgings, transforming his artistic practice into what he termed documentary painting, works that captured not merely visual reality, but the moral temperature of domestic spaces. His latest exhibition, titled Mechanical Arrangements, had drawn critical attention for its disturbing precision in rendering ordinary objects invested with psychological weight. Miss Postlethwaite had compiled a comprehensive record of the case's telephone communications, bound in leather and deposited with the local historical society as a document of significance equal to the Domesday Book. Her temporal precision had achieved legendary status throughout the county, with visitors making pilgrimages to examine her meticulously maintained exchange records. The Red Lion had embraced its newfound notoriety, advertising Miss Ashworth's room for visitors seeking proximity to criminal genius. The vicar had written to express gratitude for Wimsey's correction to the parish register. "A small but necessary truth, my lord, and no truth is small in the long companionship of time and stone." Scotland Yard had incorporated elements of Miss Ashworth's methodology into their training programs, teaching investigators to recognize how domestic knowledge could be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. Museums throughout Europe had quietly implemented new security protocols, recognizing that their greatest threats might come not from external thieves, but from those with intimate knowledge of their collections and passionate convictions about proper stewardship. The art world itself remained in considerable turmoil as authentication became a more complex and suspicious process. The revelation that forgeries could be executed with such technical sophistication, supported by falsified documentation of museum quality, had shaken confidence in established attribution methods. As autumn settled over London, Wimsey found himself returning periodically to the philosophical questions raised by Miss Ashworth's methodical approach to vigilante justice. The case had challenged his assumptions about the relationship between intellectual capability and moral reasoning, suggesting that the most dangerous criminals might be those who acted from conviction rather than passion. The fascinating aspect, Parker, he observed during one of their regular consultations, is how Miss Ashworth managed to transform murder into a form of cultural criticism. She didn't merely eliminate Cedric Thornwick. She composed a mechanical essay on the relative value of individual life versus artistic heritage. And your conclusion about such philosophical homicide? That technical brilliance divorced from moral wisdom produces results as dangerous as they are impressive. Miss Ashworth possessed the capability to serve civilization magnificently, yet chose to appoint herself its armed guardian, a role that civilization, by definition, cannot permit. A final communication from Miss Ashworth arrived as winter approached, a brief note accompanying a small watercolor sketch of her prison cell, rendered with the same technical precision she had brought to murder. Lord Peter, the note read, "I have been reflecting upon our conversation regarding craft versus art. I believe I understand now that I possessed considerable craft in service of what I mistook for art. True artistry requires not merely technical capability, but wisdom regarding its proper application. I achieved mechanical perfection while failing utterly in moral artistry, perhaps a more significant failure than simple incompetence would have been. The watercolor itself was extraordinary, capturing not merely the physical details of institutional confinement, but something of the psychological state of one who had discovered that intellectual brilliance, however methodically applied, could not substitute for moral understanding. Years later, when colleagues asked Wimsey to identify his most intellectually challenging case, he would invariably cite the mechanical murder at Thornwick Manor, not merely for its technical sophistication, but for its moral complexity. Miss Ashworth had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that the most dangerous criminals might be those who acted from the highest motives, applying extraordinary capability to purposes that seemed, from their perspective, entirely justified. She transformed an entire household into a clockwork murder device, he would conclude these recitations, yet did so in service of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. It was, simultaneously, the most selfish and most selfless crime I have encountered, a paradox that continues to challenge my understanding of human nature. As he sat in his study that final evening, examining once more the bent silver spoon that had served as both murder weapon and moral metaphor, Wimsey reflected that domestic mysteries, however mechanically precise, ultimately revealed not the workings of ingenious devices, but the far more complex machinery of human conscience operating under extraordinary pressure. "Ars est celare artem," he murmured to Bunter, who was arranging the evening's papers with his customary discretion. The art is to conceal the art. Miss Ashworth's tragedy was that she made her craft the spectacle, demanding that life conform to her mechanical arrangements, rather than allowing art to serve life's more mysterious purposes. "Very good, my lord," Bunter replied, his orthodoxy practical and his loyalty absolute. "And now," said Lord Peter, rising to adjust a window latch with unnecessary precision, "let us ensure our own domestic arrangements serve no purpose more sinister than the proper preparation of tomorrow's breakfast. After all, we have had quite enough of clean windows and hot ovens pressed into service of cold justice." The case of Thornwick Manor had taught him that the most elegant crimes, like the finest timepieces, revealed their true beauty only to those with the patience to examine their inner mechanisms, and the wisdom to understand that mechanical perfection, divorced from moral artistry, produced results as brilliant as they were terrible. Outside, London settled into its evening routine, its countless windows reflecting honest light, its domestic arrangements serving the humble but essential purposes of civilization, cooking, cleaning, and the quiet preservation of ordinary human comfort. untroubled by the dangerous precision of those who would make clockwork of conscience and engineering of ethics.